Great, thank you. And thank you for the invitation. I'm excited to speak here. I think this is a great place to talk about it, and I think this may actually be the first time that I am presenting on what is kind of the final form of the book. It's scheduled to come out in November. Um, the title is Faith Feminine? What Americans Really Think About Gender and Religion. Apologies, I realized that I don't know if I've optimized my slides for the fact that my face will be in the corner, so I will maybe try to point out some things that I end up covering. Um, so, I had a puzzle or a paradox that I was interested in, a bit confused by. There's a few things about gender and religion that have intrigued me, and I'll talk about some of them. One of them is that I've been intrigued. Why is it that Adventism is formed by a woman, or like at least that a prophetess, maybe not the only founder, but one of the founders, and the prophetess is a woman, but then women aren't necessarily given the same opportunities for some leadership roles in the religion. That's something that's puzzled me. And then something beyond Adventism that's puzzled me is why is it that religions tend to have more men in leadership and more women in the pews? I use pews specifically, and it is Christian specific, and I will talk about how some of these patterns of women being more religious than men in some ways are a Christian specific phenomenon. But yeah, the pulpit overwhelmingly led by men, the pews filled by women. It's a commonly observed dynamic. Why is this the case? So to give you a little bit of background, I'll start with kind of some narrative story, things that led me to the questions that I ask. So one thing that I became very interested in is that, I already mentioned this, the puzzle of why is it that a religion that has a woman as a prophet does not ordain women. Someone pointed out this book by Laura Vance. She is not a Seventh-day Adventist, but she writes on Seventh-day Adventism. I believe she also writes on Mormons. And this book really showed me the types of things that sociology can do and how it can make us think about why things are the way they are in the world. So why is it that there was a woman prophet, then women's leadership was restricted? Vance traces a long arc of history, and part of it is that Adventists wanted to not be seen as a cult. So actually, women had more leadership opportunities earlier on, at a time when Adventists were trying to avoid the label of cult. There was this book that came out about the four major cults, and Seventh-day Adventism got lumped in with Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Christian Science. There was kind of this move to get Adventism to fit in with evangelicalism. And part of this included restricting women's leadership. It would maybe be seen as cultish to allow women to lead at one point in time in history, and that was outside of the norm of the types of groups that Adventism was trying to fit in with. Interestingly, the PR move was effective. All of the ways that we sort Christians, Adventists oftentimes just end up with the evangelicals now. So there's, in sociology, an example, there's this religious traditions way that religious groups get sorted into 7 categories. One of them is evangelical. Adventists get sorted with the evangelicals. Mormons get set aside. And reading this book helped me see that the religious world is shaped by social processes, and things that we see happening within religion are shaped by broader factors beyond just any one individual. So there are things like, for example, Seventh-day Adventism wanting to fit in with evangelicals that would then lead to some of the things that we have now with restrictions on women's leadership. And then when I was in graduate school, so that reading that book is part of what drew me to sociology. As was mentioned, I studied theology in undergrad and also have an MDiv, and then studied the sociology of religion after that. Reading for my qualifying exam, it's this exam where you have to read a lot of books and articles on a specific topic, and then you have 3 days to, or maybe it was 2 days, 2 days to write 3 10-page essays on 3 different topics. And one of the areas that I was reading in was on gender and religion. And I, when reading, found fascinating articles that made very strong claims that didn't make a lot of sense to me. So I saw people making the argument for women being universally more religious than men, and some who attributed this to biology. It was a very complex argument, but also in some ways very simplistic. They basically said, men have more testosterone. Testosterone makes you more open to risk. Then they used Pascal's wager to say that it was risky to be non-religious, and therefore that would be why women would be more religious than men, because men have less fear of hell. I will say that the people who made these arguments did not actually measure testosterone, whether Pascal's wager links to risk preferences was also not really something they explored. But they basically made this kind of hormonal argument for why women would be more religious than men, and I didn't totally buy this, and now have been exploring some of the social factors about why some people would be more religious than others. Looking back, I didn't even totally realize it, but when I worked as a minister, I was noticing this pattern and trying to address it without really having a name for it. I was an associate pastor at a church, and me and the lead pastor were kind of noticing, the church doesn't have like a lot of men in it compared to the amount of women. And we noticed there was a lot of programming for women and not as much programming for men. And so we made additional programming. Some of this, I don't even know if we even realized the extent to which it was gendered. So we thought, you know what, we should have social things rather than just religious things, so that if people want to invite a friend, they can invite them to something that is lower stakes. They can get to know people in the community, and then once they know people in the community, then they could invite them to church. So we started having a basketball night. By default, it ended up becoming a men's basketball night. We also had a men's backpacking trip. So we had these things where we were trying to bring in kind of opportunities for people to become part of community, with then the opportunity for people to get to know people in the church, and then for it to be easier for people to invite their friends. So basically, we thought it's maybe a big ask for someone to just invite their friend to church, but inviting their friend to come play basketball as the first step seemed easier. So we basically were kind of noticing, hey, there aren't as many men, let's try to get more men. And this is a pattern that I ended up finding more broadly, that there are a lot of churches trying to do a lot of men's outreach because they perceive not enough interest from men for religion. I started studying this gap. I spent several years on it, studied it from a few different angles, mostly using existing survey data, and published some papers. But I ended up realizing there were some questions that I had that were ongoing that weren't answered by some of the existing available data. And so I decided I wanted to understand some additional things. So for example, surveys tend to ask, how religious are you? And then, what's your gender? And that would be then how people would look at the gap. But I was curious, what are the ways that people perceive religion? Do people see religion itself as feeling masculine or feminine? How might we judge other people or perceive other people depending on how religious they are? Do you perceive a person as more masculine or more feminine, or fitting more as a man or a woman, depending on how they practice their religion? So I decided to collect some original data. I did national surveys with oversamples, including some experiments. And the experiments would vary things like a person's religious affiliation, their religious practice, and also their gender, and then to see how do people perceive someone that varies across these traits or characteristics. So there's this received wisdom that women are just more religious than men. And I didn't necessarily buy this, and have been exploring, is there variation across groups in place? I ended up finding out that most of the research that would find that women were more religious than men were published in WEIRD countries. So WEIRD is an acronym that gets used to describe the countries that tend to get researched most in social scientific research. Psychology came up with this acronym. The countries tend to be Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And when other researchers studied this gender gap in religiosity, they oftentimes focused on these WEIRD countries, and then sometimes they would find odd patterns in others, and they would say, there seems to be some sort of data problem here, we're not going to use this country, and they would exclude it. But then now more recently, there's been data that's more global available that allows us to look beyond these WEIRD countries. One of the things that I decided to do for the book, and also in my work more generally, was to just see, across the world, and this are data from 66 countries around the world, covering the majority of the world population. These are the different affiliations that were in the data, and I decided to just see, who is more religious, who's less religious. The bars that go to the right, the ones at the top, these are the groups among whom women tend to be more religious than men. And the groups on the bottom are the groups where actually there are some where men tend to be more religious than women. The bold bars are statistically significant. The lighter gray ones aren't. Part of that is just simply due to smaller sample sizes for some religious groups. As you can see, for example, this survey only had 253 Jews and only 418 Taoists. But you can see just here that, the idea that women are universally more religious than men doesn't hold. Women are more religious than men among some religious groups, but not among others. So this kind of highlights already that the gendering processes may vary across different religious traditions. And it might be the religions themselves that are gendered. And so if you look at the proportion of people in a country that are a religious affiliation, countries with more Muslims, men tend to be more religious. Countries with more Christians, women tend to be more religious. So Islam and Christianity are two world's largest religions. And among one set of those countries, women tend to be more religious. The Christian ones, among the countries with more Muslims, men tend to be more religious. So whether women are more religious than men isn't a fact about women or men. It's a fact about religions. So the explanation can't be some biological thing. It can't be a hormone. Islam also has views about an afterlife. It's not just that, men feel, more willing to risk their souls or something like this. That's not the explanation for why one group is more religious than another. So to answer the question, I asked people things surveys hadn't asked before. I conducted 2 national surveys with experiments, and I also used, as I mentioned, data across 66 countries. The surveys I conducted had closed and open-ended questions. So basically, maybe they say yes or no, or they have, sets of categories, or there were also questions where there was basically a text prompt. And so I would ask them, for example, you said that women find religion more appealing than men find religion. Why do you think that's the case? Or, you perceive an atheist to be more masculine than you perceive a Christian. Why is that the case? I had a national survey that was nationally representative, and then an additional survey in order to get more Jewish and Muslim respondents. I wanted to oversample secular Jewish and Muslim respondents. I got enough secular respondents in my national survey oversample, but did not have enough Jews and Muslims. And so conducted an additional survey. It's not nationally representative, but it's based on benchmarks for the groups, and then uses survey weights. And then I also included survey experiments. You don't need to know all these facts. I'm just kind of giving you some of the basics. Okay, so I ended up developing a theory that I call the Guy theory. It's a joke play on gender. It's GIE, gendered incentives and expectations. I like to joke that Guy theory can rhyme with Guy Fieri, and maybe I should have dressed as Guy Fieri for this. But yeah, so basically the theory is that there are incentives and there are expectations that push and pull some groups more towards religion and spirituality than others. So rather than treating religion as one thing, I decided to pull apart some things we often lump together. And they turn out to be organized and gendered in different ways. So I separate out individual faith and organized religion. So if we think about religion, we can think about it as having multiple levels or areas. So for example, you might practice religion on your own, you might pray at home, or you might go and attend services at a congregation. One is a personal practice, one is tied to organized religion. So individual faith are the things that are more personal, lived, and spiritual. Organized religion, more the institutions, the authority, and the doctrine. I ended up finding out, and this is a summary of things I'm going to show you to come, that individual faith is coded as more feminine. So participating in the everyday practices of faith and spirituality is perceived as feminine, and women find more comfort in it, and people think it's more expected of women. Organized religion tends to be, run by men. So why would religion be run by men but filled by women? Part of it is this distinction between, lived religion in everyday life and in personal practice versus the institutions and structures. So individual faith, coded as feminine, offers comfort, meaning, and validation. People describe it as comforting and sympathetic in the data, and they say that it appeals to and is expected of women in ways that it's not for men. Organized religion, people perceive it as masculine. They see it as hierarchical and rule-bound. They describe it as dominant and patriarchal. They see it as run by men, built to keep being led by men. And so basically this distinction between the pulpit and the pew is in some ways the role and function of these two positions. So you could think about, the one person, it's their job, they're part of a hierarchy and a bureaucracy. One person is practicing their faith. Here's the theory laid out, and where I found a typo on the top there where it says structural factors, it should be structural factors. So I make an argument that here, there are people that are genders. So there's women, there's men. And then there's a pathway where incentives are offered to people and where they experience benefits to things. And then there are expectations. So there are things where some people might face more maybe stigma if they, for example, aren't religious. So I make the case that there are things that make religion more appealing and spirituality more appealing to women. So one of these could be experiences with more inequality and hardship. And I'll show later that people that face more hardship and also who face more discrimination tend to report getting more comfort from the same amount of religious involvement. And then there's incentives. So there's compensation and affirming community that people can get. I've made the argument in other work that men get a lot of the affirmation from the broader community. Women don't necessarily have the same avenues available to some sorts of validation, and religion and spiritual community can provide some of that. So these are kind of the incentives and the needs that are met by those incentives that might pull women towards religiosity. And then expectations. So there's cultural factors. So there's gendered norms and traits and socialization. So for example, let's imagine one group of people is encouraged to follow the rules, do what they're supposed to do, be very concerned with morality. We could also think too about, sitting still in a pew might be, and I'll show some quotes. Sometimes men would just be like, yeah, it's too boring to go to church. I can't sit still. The music's mushy. Then we could think about expectations. So some religions have specific expectations. I showed earlier that among Jews and Muslims, but also Taoists, that men tend to be more religious than women. But part of this comes from how we measure and think about religion. So for example, if one group of people is expected to attend religious services and the other is not, the one group is probably going to attend religious services more. And in Islam and in Judaism, there are different gendered expectations about attendance and some types of participation in religion. And I would make the case that although Christianity doesn't necessarily have explicit expectations around, maybe men don't have to go to church, but women have to, that there are informal and social things where women kind of face a little more expectation to attend, and men are kind of, the stereotype might be that the man stays home and watches football on Sundays, whereas the woman takes the kids to church. So maybe Adventism would have a little bit different thing going on because the football's not a factor. So I'm arguing there's two pathways, one incentives, one expectations. There's the incentives, the pull, the expectations, the push, and they play out at three levels. So the individual and the institutional I already talked about, but there's also the interactional. So this is when you are relating to others, but maybe a small amount of them. So you on your own is the individual, the institution, structure, the organization, that's the institutions of society. But the interactions is, maybe when you're talking to your friends, when you interact with people in your family, and how we judge other people's faith plays out here. And I'll show some things that women tend to get more affirmed for practicing religion in a way that men don't exactly in the same way, but they can as well. And then there are also differences in kind of people think that men can just, it's sort of acceptable for men to just not go to church. Okay, so the general idea here and kind of the distinction of, why is it that women are in the pews, men are in the pulpit, it is in part that personal faith is feminine and organized religion is masculine. So by distinguishing the individual and personal elements from the organized, we can just see that the one is perceived as feminine, the other is masculine. And I'll show some of the data here, also show some quotes. So if you ask about faith, people ask for one vocabulary. If you ask them about religion, they reach for another. So if you look through how people talk about things, about their religion or their spirituality or their faith, for more individual faith, spirituality, personal practice, they talked about it as comforting, sympathetic, nurturing, caring, and intuitive, and also that the people that engage in these things have these characteristics and traits. If you ask people about organized religion, or if you ask people about practicing religion in dogmatic ways, so basically saying, we're right and everyone else is wrong, they tend to see that as more dominant, patriarchal, controlling, hierarchical, or authoritarian. Okay, so if you just ask people about how feminine or masculine two words are, here ask some people about religion, some people about spirituality. If you ask people about religion, they tend to see it as more masculine. If you ask people about spirituality, they see it as more feminine. This might almost seem obvious. This might be a thing that if you thought about it, you'd say, yes, this would be the case. But I couldn't think of anything or couldn't find anything in the literature where anyone had actually measured this before. So I just asked, how masculine or feminine is religion? How masculine or feminine is spirituality? And religion was read as comparatively more masculine. And then people draw this distinction in their own terms. They'll talk about this if you ask them questions about religion, about how they perceive religion themselves, or among others. So here's some quotes. So people draw this distinction. I include some info here about who the people are. So a non-Orthodox Jewish woman said, she's 66 years old, said, women seem to be more openly religious in general, but men seem to control the institutions of religion. So she was basically talking about this spirituality or individual faith and organization distinction. A just Christian black man. So this is someone who, just Christian means that when they're asked about their religious affiliation, they say just Christian and they don't list a specific denomination. He said, religion is a system of control, and it seems most religious texts were written by men. Spirituality is a different thing altogether. I am spiritual. So for him, he thought spirituality was, kind of the pathway that he found useful. I'll also talk at the end about how society is sort of moving in this way generally, that they're moving toward the things that we perceive as more feminine, and kind of what people are moving away from are the things that might be perceived as more masculine. A Muslim Asian American woman, 39 years old, said, because the pronoun he is used to denote God and the majority of prophets were male, the hierarchy of religious institutions are male. So people, if they talk about the institution, they talk about masculine things and men. If they talk about practice and faith and spirituality, they see it as more feminine. They talk about more women. Okay, here's what a Protestant man, 24 years old, said. There were some people that saw Jesus as a fairly feminine figure, and they would talk about this, and sometimes it would be Christian men complaining about how feminine Jesus was. So he said, I feel like Jesus treated people as if he was mothering them. And in some ways, I think he was saying this as a positive, but I think also in some ways this was kind of seen as like a negative. If we think about things like Christian nationalism and certain types of approaches to religion, we might think about these more feminine perceived expressions, things like nurture and care, not really aligning with said set of values. Okay, now if you describe a person in a little story about them being religious or non-religious, about dogmatic, non-dogmatic, how feminine or masculine they are, the perceptions would vary. And so basically what I found was that when a woman is described as more religious, she's perceived as more feminine. And also if you describe her as non-dogmatic, and I'll explain what I mean by that is also perceived as more feminine among a woman. So a woman is kind of perceived as performing her gender more correctly, based on whether being religious or not and dogmatic or not. There wasn't a big difference in perceived femininity among men, but there was on masculinity, and you could see the book to find that. So dogmatic, for me, I described a story where one person is described as either kind of seeing their views as right and everyone else's is wrong, and people need to believe what they believe, or they say, there are lots of different ways of thinking, their faith is very important to them, but they don't push that on other people. And so the non-dogmatic approach is read as more feminine among both women and men, and then being more religious is seen as being more feminine among women. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the gendered carrots and sticks of religious life. So these incentives, these expectations, the things that push, the things that pull. Faith offers the most comfort to those facing the most hardship. So if you think about sociodemographic groups, whatever group tends to have less status or material security in society tends to find more comfort in religion. And then also people who report experiencing more discrimination in their everyday life report receiving more comfort from religion. So women report more comfort from religion than men. Black people report more comfort from religion than Hispanic people, who report more comfort from religion than white people. People with lower earnings report more comfort from religion than people with higher earnings. And people who experience discrimination most often report the most comfort received from religion. So sometimes people just sort of named the explanations. It was very interesting to me. If I just asked people, like, why do you think women are more religious than men sometimes? Or why do you think gender differences in religion exist? Some of the people gave better answers than some of the literature had given in the past. So as I mentioned, some of the literature had made these arguments about hormones. But then I think some of these people just sort of had a general understanding of some of the types of things that might push or pull people from religion. So a Reformed Jewish woman said, when people have less control over their lives, they often turn to religion. Probably more women find themselves in that position. So basically saying that if a group experiences more existential insecurity, this is a term that others have used, they will turn to religion more. A Jewish woman, 42, said, women are generally not in the same position of power, so religion gives them something to hold on to and believe in. And a white, just Christian woman, 71 years old, said, men often think they are so strong they can handle everything themselves. Women are more apt to lean on someone, in this case, the Lord. So she, kind of noted men kind of want to do their own thing and not have anyone tell them what to do. And so her perception was that, men don't turn to religion, but women are more likely to turn to it, either because they need it more or because they're more open to the possibility of listening to what others have to say or following other people's guidance. And so also some people just said that faith and spirituality just fits women more. So a Sunni Muslim woman, 20 years old, said, women are taught to express their thoughts and feelings from an early age. It's more common for men to be taught to suppress emotions and passions. And she was connecting this to some types of religious practice and especially spirituality. A multiracial Buddhist man, 40 years old, said, spirituality is a way to nurture the soul, and this message is often most appealing to women who are nurturing by nature. So some people would pull onto these stereotypes that would say maybe women are more nurturing, either because they kind of have a stereotype of the way women are, or maybe they would talk about, social processes in society and things like motherhood, and saying that these sorts of things would pull women toward religion. White Jewish man, 68 years old, said, men are generally focused on work while women are focused on family. Religion tends to fall into the purview of women. So he was basically saying that things like religious upbringing might be a role that women are supposed to do because they're supposed to take care of the kids, whereas men are at work. And it sometimes gets assumed that motherhood is a part of this, and that family plays an important role here. So a religiously unaffiliated white man, 58 years old, said, I think it's coming from motherhood. Mothers always think more about kids than men. They dream good things for them and help them develop spirituality. An agnostic man of Jewish and Native American heritage said, religion is learned in the household where the mother is queen. A white Protestant woman, 71, said, women are usually more responsible for the religious education of their children. So people basically saw that parenting was a part of what is faith and spiritual life, and that women are more responsible for this. And so, for example, if women are supposed to take their kids to church, if women are supposed to maybe help lead Sabbath school, get kids there, make sure these things happen, and then men are kind of not seen as having, in everyday life as much time spent in these roles. Okay, so if you just ask people, do you think religion is more appealing or spirituality is more appealing to women or men? If you use the word religion, about 80% say that religion is more appealing. If you ask about spirituality, about 90% say religion's more appealing to women. So religion, 80%, spirituality, 90% of people will say that it's more appealing to women than to men. So basically, people just think that religion, and especially spirituality, offers more to women. If you ask people about how acceptable it is for people to be non-religious, about 87% said that it's more acceptable for men than for women to be non-religious. I don't have a lot of the quotes here, but some of them got at things like, some people said men can just get away with anything, and this isn't even about just religion, whereas others would talk about things like family, expectations of faith and spirituality, about what it means to be a good woman, and that it's expected of women to be religious. So here's a couple of these types of quotes. Men who stray from religion are often hailed as intellectual, whereas women are questioned and scrutinized for making the same declaration of faith. I feel like society would be a lot quicker to judge and condemn a non-religious woman, and there is a prejudice. We believe all women should be religious, but a man has a past not to be. For men, faith can actually be read as a confession of weakness, so turning to God, turning to others could actually be seen as not being particularly masculine. Men feel religion is not masculine, even though they may be as religious as women. They just don't want others to know being religious is not macho. Sometimes men think it is a sign of weakness. They think because of cultural conditioning, they shouldn't need anyone's help. Men have a stronger drive to be in control and not appear weak. This makes it harder for them to accept that God is in control of their life. So people basically perceived a difference by gender in whether people would want to turn to others for support and help. And so both there might be less of a need for men to turn to support for others and help in a society where, gender structures parts of our lives. And for example, men tend to have more money than women. But then also there's just this perception that men, don't want to turn to others. It's weakness. So someone said too that not only is it that men might be kind of seen as feminine for being religious, they sometimes would perceive it as, masculine, tough, or brave to be secular. So a religiously unaffiliated white woman said, "I think a free-thinking male is strong. It takes thick skin to be an atheist." Okay, so the gender gap reverse. So I'm going to show you that if we account for some factors, it's not actually women who would look more religious than men, but I'm actually going to show that accounting for these factors, it would be men who would be more religious. So I'm going to show you here, these are just, I'm not going to get into all this, I'm going to show you a slide that has fewer things. But basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to account for feminine and masculine typed traits among individuals, and then also the psychological benefits, including comfort and strength, that people get from religion. And so the gap between women and men, before you account for these things, the gap on the standardized scale, women would be about 0.18 more religious than men. If you account for feminine type traits, actually masculine type traits didn't do much, but it was feminine type traits did, that gap would be cut into less than half. So if you account for people saying that they perceive themselves to be comforting, gentle, affectionate, some of the types of things that we basically would associate with the fruits of the Spirit, that accounting for those things is a part of why women are more religious than men. Then the real factor here, though, is who is getting more psychological comfort and strength from religion. If you account for psychological strength and comfort that people perceive from religion, that they get from it, it would actually be men would be more religious. In other words, what this means is that if it weren't for the fact that women tend to have more stereotypically feminine type psychological traits, which basically overlap with the fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, faithfulness, self-control. These are basically very similar to the items that get used in this psychological inventory called the BEM sexual inventory to measure femininity. If it weren't for these traits being higher among women and associated with more religiousness among Christians, and if it weren't for women getting more comfort from religion than men, it would actually be men who would be more religious than women, which might be what we would expect. If we think about religion as masculine, if we think about it as being run by men or even dominated by men, we might be confused. Why would women follow it? The reason why we see the gendered patterns and why women tend to follow religion more than men tends to basically be these feminine type traits and also the psychological incentives provided from religion. Okay, so without the feminine coding of faith and the comfort it offers the disadvantaged, women would be less religious than men, which is what you'd expect from an institution built and led by men. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit now about how people perceive religion, not just their own religion, but also other people's religion. This is a quote from a respondent. Most religions, and this was actually a Jewish woman, so most religions except Judaism are patriarchal. But I saw similar quotes from others as well, and I'll also show you some broader patterns in the data. So different faiths are read as more or less masculine or feminine. So the dark bars here are perceived masculinity. The lighter bars here are perceived femininity. So you can see here that Christianity, even Christianity, but it's now here perceived as the institution, is perceived as a little more masculine and feminine, but Judaism and especially Islam are perceived as more masculine. But something to keep in mind is these perceptions in part come from the position in which they're talking about it. So if people are talking about their own religion, they tend to think about the practice of religion, the everyday lived religion, what they get from religion. If they talk about other people's religions, they tend to talk about the institution, the public image of the organization. So an example here is Islam. So among Muslims describe Islam as gentle, comforting, and sympathetic. Non-Muslims describe it as assertive, dominant, and risk-taking. So insiders know a faith's lived personal side, the part that reads feminine. Outsiders see only the institution, the parts that read masculine. Almost everyone calls their own religion nurturing, and everyone else is patriarchal. So basically, my religion's good for women, your religion's bad for women, and everyone says that. Even a secular person would say, secularism is good for women, other groups are bad for women. So basically, anyone would say, yeah, my religion's good for women. Okay, the comfort gap is a Christian story. So this is a general pattern of who receives more comfort from religion and spirituality by gender. So the darker bars are indicating women receiving more comfort from spirituality. The lighter gray bars are men receiving comfort from spirituality. And it's among the general population, but also because the general population is mostly Christian, but also among the non-religious, women report more comfort from religion and spirituality than men. But among Jews and among Muslims, men and women actually report receiving similar amounts of comfort from religion, which can help explain why it is that with the patterns we saw earlier about the variations in gender gaps and religiosity across traditions. Okay, so I'm going to talk very briefly. There's broader political implications I'm not going to get into this in a lot of detail because I don't want to talk forever, but this is in the book. But there's patterns where people perceived religion as providing comfort, but also perceived it as kind of controlling people's outlook. So they would say that religion appeals to the marginalized, but then it tells them how to think. It comes bundled with perspectives. Okay, so now to get to the conclusion of the book, I'm making an argument that there's a couple of things going on. So one is that the religion that's declining in the world, it tends to be the institutional organized kind. The types that are holding steady or even increasing tend to be more individualized, tend to be more spirituality. If you think about, how many people are going to church versus how many people are going to say like something like a meditation retreat, we could see a decline in the one and a rise in the other. And we might see it perceived as that, maybe it's a man running the church that people aren't attending anymore. And perhaps it's a woman running, the yoga studio or the meditation retreat. And so there's a kind of movement out of the organized religion into some of the things that the, medieval church labeled as pagan and said you aren't supposed to do these things. Those are the things that tend to be perceived as more feminine. And some of that is what people are returning to now. So just to show a figure here, these dark bars show measures that are more about individual faith and spirituality. The gray dotted bars are more measures of organized religion. So if you look at the percentage of people who are religiously affiliated, the percentage of people who attend weekly, the percentage of people who say they're very religious, these things are going down. If you look at belief in an afterlife, if you look at the rate at which people report praying daily, if you look at the rate at which people report being very spiritual, these are holding steady, if not going up. So the number of people who say they're very spiritual is actually going up over time. Okay, so people are leaving the masculine institution but keeping the feminine faith. Masculine coded organized religion is what people are moving away from. So the hierarchy, the required membership, institutional authority, they're holding on to things like spirituality, contemplation, personal meaning, saying that they're spiritual, praying, believing in an afterlife. Among the youngest adults, we're actually seeing an interesting pattern of potential gendered reversal. Part of this is, I argue, tied up with politics and gendering, and that basically with the rise of things like Christian nationalism and some macho and or militant forms of Christian outreach, and then also some of the types of maybe quote unquote maybe more dogmatic approaches to how people talk about social and political issues, that it seems to be that politics is playing an increasing role in how religious people are. So it used to be the case that if you wondered how religion and politics were related, you would maybe look at what is a person's religion and then think about how that shaped their politics. Now there are patterns happening where a person's politics can end up shaping their religion. We can see this happening with when Trump and the Pope had a public disagreement, that we saw some Catholics, saying, I'm not Catholic anymore, but they were Trump supporters. And so in that case, their politics shaped then what they said their religion was. And I think that then this is part of what's happening. And part of what we're seeing among some of the youngest generation is that men, specifically conservative men, and there's actually a divergence on politics among some of the youngest people, that some of the youngest men are quite conservative, some of the youngest women are quite liberal, and that it seems to be that among some of the youngest, men might actually become more religious than women. Okay, so to report kind of like where the feeling is headed, where people in society are going, we can look at what a Black Christian man said, 23 years old. Spirituality isn't about trying to act like a tough guy, it's more compassion and sympathy. This is actually the same person who earlier talked about how he saw religion as kind of this masculine thing, but that he saw himself as spiritual. So he wants to be compassionate and sympathetic. He doesn't want to be a tough guy. And for him, he's more spiritual than he is religious. Okay, so we can now think about how this is lived out in Adventism. So a faith co-founded by a woman prophet, Ellen White. There was a time where women could lead, but then they couldn't. Now there's a reopening and ongoing and kind of maybe in some ways increasing debate around whether women should be able to lead. We could also then think now about how gendered expectations and incentives run through Adventist history and also the present. So through the choices its leaders face now, political entrenchment or spiritual authenticity, what direction is Adventism going to go? Is it going to go more the route of trying to be, quote unquote, maybe authentically spiritual and faithful and to, follow Jesus? Or is it going to focus on the institution, the organization, the hierarchy? So if we think about the question of what is faith feminine is about, what's going on are gendered experiences, incentives, and expectations. Who gets to hold authority? Who gets what from religion and spirituality? And I would argue that there are a lot of social and psychological factors that shape why one gender might be more religious than another in one religion, and then maybe a different pattern in a different one. Okay, so something I want us to think about is, where have you seen religion get gendered or seen incentives and expectations push people towards faith or pull them away? Here's my name, here's my email, last name @cornell.edu. And then I'm going to do the shameless plug. Please read the book. It's out in November. If you end up deciding to buy it, please buy the paperback, not hardcover. And please feel free to get it from the library. Don't feel like you need to buy this. Just read it when you can. I don't know if when it's out, you can email me and I could get you a PDF of it. So this is more about suggesting that you read it than that you buy it. And that's my presentation. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing with us this afternoon, or Landon. I don't know if you want to. Right. I was just going to ask you to stop sharing so we could see better. Really appreciates the care with which and the attention to detail, with which you've treated this topic. But there are a couple of persons who really want to get into the conversation. Lauren, your hand was up pretty early, so please go ahead and join this conversation.
Yeah, Landon, you'll excuse me for doing a little bit of an advertisement here. I always announce early in the class who's going to be next week. Next week we have Dr. Randa Brinsman. He's one of our favorites. And I'm trying to remember what he told me. I'll look it up before we finish the class, what he's going to be talking about. And then the week after that, we have Dr. Gil Valentine from La Sierra University, and he is going to be addressing. Um, this is going to be an Adventist history class. Basically, he's going to be talking about Jan Andrews and how he was his clashes with the whites, which should be interesting. Turns out the whites weren't that easy to get along with, even though the wife was the prophet of the organization, and he's written about that, and he's going to talk about that. Landon, what strikes me when I think about my own relationship with the religion, I certainly, when I went into ministry, I certainly wanted to serve God somehow. But what I also realized was that I'm not a particularly emotionally affected person. Does that make sense? It was when people would be, I don't know if this is male or just German, but when people would be really feeling emotional and raising their hands or going forward to an altar call, I always kind of held back from that. Now, that may just be me, but I suspect there's something maybe male about that too. More of an introvert, more of a thinking and not so much of a feeling person. But I'm trying to figure out quite how that fits in, because I didn't have too much. I'm not sure that I really realized at that time um, how much leadership had to do with it. To me, it was more of a matter of I wanted to serve God in some way or another. And suddenly, as a pastor, I found myself being the guy standing up in front and said, "Hey, everybody, I've got an idea. Everybody, follow me. I'm going to do this thing." And never really quite felt at home with that either. But I'm wondering about the emotional part of it. That's the part that interests me. I think most of my female friends who are really into church probably are more empathetic in a lot of ways than I am. I've often wished I had more of that, but I tend to default to the cognitive more than to the feeling. I don't know, just something to throw out there. I don't know what you would say about that. Is it personal or is that male? I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, this is a great question. So obviously, anyone can have kind of any personality traits, but there are some traits
Sure.
that are more common among women or more common among men. Among women, they report sympathy and empathy as a character trait or personality trait that they have more of. Men will report more analytical as a personality trait. And we might even think then
Absolutely
about
true for me.
how analytical
Yeah.
would get distributed across different religious practices or beliefs or expressions. My survey didn't have enough Adventists in it to look at Adventists separately, but I can note two groups that were quite high on reporting being very analytical, and this was among both women and men. And one was secular people, and one was Jewish people. And they reported being quite analytical. And I think that part of it might be that Judaism might be seen as kind of like a study-based tradition in some ways, and maybe Adventism is a little bit of that too, where study is a big part of it, rather than
Mhm.
maybe just more maybe like emotional expression. I'll also note though an interesting thing that I found was that among both women and among men, people who report being more empathetic will also say they are more religious, but this is primarily among Christians. And so there's some sort of association between being empathetic, affectionate, gentle, caring, and how religious a person is. Um,
Mhm.
but this pattern seems to be pretty specific to Christians. In the book, I talk about the fruits of the Spirit, the Beatitudes. Also, I cite a paper where someone else said some of the similar things, that some of Christianity's teachings could almost be seen as directly feminine. Um, Peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control. These are things that if you ask, a psychological researcher, are these feminine typed personality traits or masculine type, they're going to say feminine. And so, yeah, I think emotions definitely plays a role here. I also could see it being that maybe like an analytical person, maybe they're like, yeah, I don't want to follow, but I'll lead. I could even think
Mhm.
about, when I would give sermons, I would think about it. I was like, you know what, like, and maybe this is part of what even drew me to studying ministry. I was like, I think I get too bored listening to other people's sermons, but I don't get too bored doing my own. Not because mine are better, but because
Yes.
delivering it is kind of inherently an activity. Like you're doing something interesting, even if it's maybe stressful, but you're doing something, and so it's hard to get bored while you're preaching. And I guess if you get bored while you're preaching, everyone else is probably way more bored than you are. So yeah, so I definitely think that our own emotions and then like the things that we're drawn to both might shape, how we approach and experience religion. And then maybe, yeah, maybe there's some sort of traits that draw us to want to be the leader. And we say, you know what, I would maybe be too bored listening to someone else's sermon.
I mean, I'm not sure it was wanting to be the leader as much as wanting to explain in a sort of cognitive level. That's the part that interested me. I was interested. A friend of mine who was in the conference office. I asked him one time what drove him to worship. He's very, very cognitive. He said, "Well, I love coming to your church because everything was explained step by step, and nobody could see anything except what you were explaining because it was so carefully." Now, I'm not bragging. I'm just saying that's how he saw it. And yeah, I enjoyed that. I enjoyed saying, "I don't know how you guys can get out of this argument. I've got this, man."
Yeah, we might even think
But
too about, yeah, like, maybe one person in their personal devotion, maybe they pray more and their prayers are more about emotions and feelings. And another person, they maybe, they want to get out the Bible commentary and, study all the facts and information. And these are both ways of, practicing personal devotion. But, maybe, overlapping with gender type traits and approaches.
yeah, I used to. One of my friends said, "You should do. Why don't you do some really powerful altar calls?" And I tried, man. I really tried, and it just felt artificial. It wasn't me. I felt like, I mean, I felt like I was drag or something. I mean, it was just not. It was not. my natural mode of trying to get people worked up emotionally to get them to, while every eye is closed and the organ softly plays, come forward. So, I mean, that's where I landed, Landon. I'm not sure it was ever terribly effective. I think I would have preferred to be somebody who could manipulate the emotions more, or I should say, I would have been more effective, put it that way.
Yeah.
Anyway,
All
thanks. This
right.
was great.
Thanks so much, Lauren, for sharing and getting us started. David, I'm going to ask you to unmute and join the conversation.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for a wonderful presentation, Landon. I appreciated how you sort of problematized that relationship between gender and religion. I was curious if in this process you engaged at all with the problematization of religion. In the past year, I've read William Kavanaugh's The Myth of Religious Violence, and from there went on to Tomoko Masuzawa's The Invention of World Religions, and they talk about the way that religion was created conceptually as a tool of colonialism, basically. It was a way of saying what we have is the best, our culture is the best, and disqualifying everybody else. And also supporting the nation state. And so then the nation state becomes, religion is violent and bad and all these things. The nation state is good. And it seems to me the question that comes out of that, and so I'm curious how you've engaged with this, the question that comes out of that in part is whether that plays into this as well, that it is maybe not so masculine to be Christian, but it is very masculine to be in the military. And serve your nation state. And we don't say that's religion, even though it has many of the same markers of devotion. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So this literature is a very interesting one, I think. This invention of religions, Wilfred Smith, Talal Assad, the what you mentioned. So there's a few books about countries. So there's a book about invention of religion in India, a book about invention of religion in Japan, and Japan gets counted as incredibly secular on surveys. But then when people are asked, how religious are you? The translated word is often this word shukyo. Sorry, everybody, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing this word. But this is a word in Japanese that's basically for Western religion. And so then if someone says they're not this, what they're saying is they're not Western religious. And so that doesn't mean they're not religious. It doesn't mean they're not spiritual. It doesn't mean they don't engage in, ancestor worship, various practices. It just means that they don't see themselves as, Western religion. So one of the things that I do in this book and in some other places is talk about the fact that some of the ways we even measure religion don't work for some groups. So for example, believing in God means something very different for a Christian or a Muslim versus a Buddhist. Especially depending on if you ask about, do you believe in a theistic God? A Buddhist says no. Does that mean that Buddhist is an atheist? And so, yeah, I think there's definitely things going on here. I also think that there's this gendered component. One of the things that I think about, and in the end of the book, I talk about this like rewilding of faith. So I think about like that faith was maybe like kind of like a, naturally occurring, very like some sort of like a grove. There's a lot of trees, flowers, things growing. Religion comes in and wants to make it very organized and systematized. It wants to put up walls. It wants to put up labels on things. It wants to put up paths. And I think part of what's happening and what I make with this argument of rewilding is people wanting to exit outside that. Now, the way this connects to what you asked is the distinction between what a religion calls as properly religious versus what they discount as spirituality, or worse, saying that something is just superstition or pagan. And so oftentimes, if we think about, a systematic theology textbook, no one's going to call that pagan. But someone having a little figure that they pray to, they're going to call that pagan. And one is this organized Western colonial systematized thing. And then one is this everyday lived practice. And these are very gendered. And I would make the case then, too, that some of the overly militant nature of some of religion is part of what is leading some people to leave. And sometimes they're then leaving to things like, ancient spiritual practices that, are part of what maybe the medieval Catholic Church was trying to stamp out and saying, this is pagan. This doesn't count. This is superstition. And so I think that, we could think quite a bit about what gets counted as religion versus what gets counted as superstition. And then, who is doing real religion. But yeah,
Thank
great
you.
question. Thank you.
It was great.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that question, David. I just want to follow up on that. It's related a little bit to what Lauren asked and to what David just asked, Landon. And that is, I really see a lot of themes with strong versus weak in terms of religion versus spirituality. And that is one of the things that I often hear, and maybe why with the rise of Christian nationalism, you're seeing more men um, gravitate towards that. But as David said, being in the military requires the same kind of disciplined, systematic approach to how you live your life that religion often requires. But what did you see, if anything, on those thoughts where religion was seen as strong because of that kind of structured approach, while spirituality, where it's often perceived as, I said, leaning into the compassion, leaning into finding community, that sort of a thing. Did you see any of those strong versus weak themes coming out with the masculine versus feminine perceptions?
Yeah, definitely. This is a great question, and for sure. So some of the open-ended quotes, people would talk about things that, men want to be strong, and doing spirituality is not strong. But maybe religion is, and doing religion dogmatically could be. So I'm right, you have to believe what I believe, that is strong. It was seen as weak to be non-dogmatic, to say, I believe what I believe, it's very important to me, but I'm not going to force it on you. So both, whether people were religious, how much religious they were, whether they were spiritual, and then also this kind of what I call dogmatic versus non-dogmatic approach. Women tend to be more religious, but less dogmatic about the way they are religious. They tend to be more spiritual. They tend to have maybe like more prayer. And men tend to be like maybe a little more rigid in their beliefs. And so definitely too, there were respondents connecting these ideas of strong and weak, and that they would say that a man who is too religious or especially too spiritual might not be seen as very strong. He might be seen as weak, and that might not be of interest to him. I had respondents who were, it was funny to see, the Christian men who are mad at Christianity for being too feminine and weak and mushy. I didn't end up putting it in here, but there's a quote from a guy who's like, the songs are all about feelings. Why would I want to do that? That's so boring. I don't want to come sing about my feelings. And also, why am I singing? I should be thinking about things. This should be cognitive. I should be learning. And so there was definitely this sense of like what religion is supposed to be, this affective versus this cognitive, and then also this idea of strength versus weakness, and kind of both, hierarchical, institutional, dogmatic religious men are seen as strong, and then also secular men are seen as strong, where it's the like humbly religious and spiritual people that are seen as like the weak ones. But then some people also said that like it takes a real man to be willing to do spiritual things, because people might think he's weak, but that means he's actually stronger. And then they sometimes would connect that to Jesus as a figure, that there was like strength and weakness.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much for that, Landon. Nick, you've been quite patient. Please go ahead and join the conversation.
Oh no, I just looked that way. Thank you, Cherry, and I appreciate it. Landon, I really, this is a fascinating study. I can't wait to get and read your book. Um, a couple of things. The first one, emotionality, and people typically connected with femininity. And then I grew up in the toughest neighborhood the country probably had. And trust me, we were emotional, but we take your head off. Like King David, King David would take your head off and then write a song about it afterwards. And so I'm wondering about that. But the other thing, you made mention of the fact that certain religions like Islam, and I'm very closely associated with members of the Islamic community, where it is more, the men are more religious than the women. And I'm wondering, is that because religion at times is evaluated based upon expression, and in a religion like Islam, men are allowed to be more expressive than women are, and what metrics you use in making that measurement? And then last but not least, I noticed a digital drum set behind you, and I got to think that you must be a drummer. So
Yeah, no, I am, and I realized that I kind of have blur on, but my blur is not on high enough for people to not see that I have drums. Yeah, so Islam had some really interesting patterns. So one of the things that I thought that was really interesting among Muslims is that actually being more masculine was a little bit associated with being more spiritual. And that wasn't the case among really any other groups. Another interesting thing that I found for Muslims is that there seems to be a difference between Muslim majority societies and then Muslims in like Christian majority nations. In Muslim majority societies, the mosque, you basically go and you pray, and it's a community center, and men are supposed to do it. Mosques in the US can sometimes end up practicing a little bit of the function of like what a church does. So churches are often, yes, a place you go worship, but it's sort of like a family-centric community center. Where you have a lot of programming for kids. And then also, too, if you think about the general programming that's outside of the main religious service, it's maybe feminine typed, like people might perceive prayer meeting as feminine. And so, the patterns for Islam, it actually varies a bit. So it's actually in Muslim majority societies where it's men are a good deal more religious than women, but that pattern isn't as much different in the US. Same pattern I've found for Jews, that in Israel, Jewish men are a lot more religious than Jewish women, but in the US, there's not as much of a difference. So I think some of it too is sort of like, what is the purpose and function of the religious meeting place? The mosque, the synagogue, the church, is it a place where the men go and it's, civic participation and almost a part of like community and like almost political life? Or is it a place where it's a spiritual practice, the family and the community gathered together? And then also this point about how people can be both, like very emotional, but then also maybe like strong and tough. And it's like maybe like a hot-headed men's type of emotional versus like, maybe a meeker type of emotional for women. I didn't explore this a lot, but I did see some of the things that people said where they would talk about they would say that men pretend like they're not emotional, but they just express their emotions in different ways. And that someone being like telling everyone else that they're wrong is kind of emotional too. And so, like what we perceive of as emotion is very much, in some ways a social process as well. So these are great points. So the Islam pattern is in part, I think, a function of that men are expected to attend, and that pattern is strongest in more, Muslim majority communities, whereas in the US, a lot of mosques will have a good amount of women in attendance. These are great points. So the emotionality, the toughness, the Islam Christianity, and I'm a drummer, but I'm not very good.
Observation, and then I'm out. And that is, I remember talking to one of my lawyer friends, a white gentleman, and he said, well, he told me, he said, Nick, black people are more emotional and women are more emotional. And, at that point, I held myself back from him. And he said, we're more analytical and more constrained. And I'm following up on Lauren's original content. And the next week, I saw him at the 50-yard line screaming like an amphetamine chicken with his shirt off and his face painted, yelling. He wasn't on the field, but he's yelling, "We're winning." And I'm noticing that people have selected places for the display of their emotions and accepted times for it. And I'm not sure how to qualify it or define it, but I just take notice of that as an observation. But thanks. I can't wait to read your book, man.
Yeah, this is a great point. And I think that people, it's sort of, what is religion or not religion? It's sort of oftentimes the people in power are deciding what they think is proper religion versus superstition. And then I think that sometimes people in power want to say what is logic and rational, and then what is, overly emotional. And like men at a sports stadium, the type of emotionality that they're showing, but they get to say like, no, that's not emotion. That's just playtime. That's fun. That's not real. But yes, like maybe they keep wearing the same stinky shirt because they think it brings them good luck, and they do all these things, but they say like, no, I'm still rational and logical. And so I think some of that is like the image they want to convey. Same with religion, that they want to say the things I do are religion, the things you do are superstition.
Thank you, man. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Nick, for sharing and for asking those really interesting questions. Ed, please go ahead and join the conversation.
I want to nominate Nick as having the most colorful expressions. I especially like David will take your head off and then write a song about it. Landon, I want to make an assertion and then ask you a question. And not everybody's going to agree with my assertion, probably. The idea of God and religious belief are not independently verifiable. They can't be objectively proved, so to speak. If that's true, did you discover anything in your research where there are gender differences because of that dynamic? Because in the end, believing in God and whatever religious belief we have is a matter of faith, because it can't be objectively proven. Did you find anything like that dynamic?
Yeah, some of that here, and that also connects to some research I'm currently conducting. So there was a reason why, like, yes, it's for alliteration in part, is faith feminine, but in part too, it's the concept of faith, and that you believe in something that you don't see, that you are willing to accept uncertainty and go forward with it, could be seen as a feminine thing. I'm currently working on a research project that looks at not whether people believe in God, but I guess that is a part of it too. But the main thing that I'm exploring is do you think, there's a survey question that was asked by the Pew Research Center, and I'm using their data. It basically asks people, do you think the world is all there is, or is there a spiritual realm beyond it that we cannot see? And the gendered patterns on this are larger than the ones on religion. Women will say that there is something spiritual beyond what we can see. Men will say the world is all there is. Some of those men who say the world is all there is are religious. Some of them believe in God. I'm not exactly sure how. Maybe they believe in some sort of pantheism or something. But if we think about kind of ontologies and ways of thinking about and viewing the world, what we consider, good information, if you think about gendered patterns in just disagreements and communication, people will say that women are more willing to consider feelings as actual information and to take them into account when making decisions, which can actually be helpful in leadership positions. Whereas men, they only want to take like the factual, specific, verifiable information that they can use, and they basically will sometimes disregard feelings because they don't think that that is, rational or verifiable enough. So I think that there definitely is something going on here where part of this is being open to uncertainty. Part of this is my dogmatic, not dogmatic idea that I'm looking at is also about like, are you rigid and like say this is the correct belief, or do you believe but say like I could be wrong? And so the men are more likely to basically think that they are right regardless. Now they might be still having faith, but they're having it in this kind of rigid way, whereas women seem to tolerate a decent amount of doubt and uncertainty and say this is what I choose to believe and this is what I follow. And so, yeah, I think there definitely is some of this, like, is this a verifiable fact that, I can use science for, or is this something that I can feel and intuit? And people in the open-ended responses talked quite a bit that, like, women are more in touch with nature and things beyond the here and now, and they can just understand and intuit things that men can't. And so some of them would explain that women would be more, especially spiritual, in a sense because they're able to be, whereas men are too closed-minded to see anything kind of beyond the whole like doubting Thomas type of approach where like, if I can't see it and verify it, a scientific method, then therefore I will not believe it.
So my takeaway from your answer is that men are doomed.
No, I think it's just that, we have gendered ways of approaching and seeing the world. I would also say that these gendered ways of approaching and seeing the world aren't necessary, and that some of this is socialization in society. So, the fact that women are more empathetic, I wouldn't necessarily attribute that to some sort of, biological factor. It's sort of how we're socialized, and I think that men can learn a lot and be a lot more in touch with their emotions. But also part of the challenge is they're less open to it. So like a woman's going to be maybe more likely to go to therapy, even though maybe it's the man who needs the therapy more, but he's unwilling to go.
Yeah, hey, thank you.
Thank you so much, Ed. Doug, please go ahead and join the conversation.
I was just laughing at myself and maybe beyond, thinking that here we are being analytical about the genderization of religion. I'm not sure what that says about our analyticalness, but maybe I shouldn't even go there. In any case, that really wasn't my thought until just the last passage in your conversation. I just finished a 2 DVD set called Mythos One by Joseph Campbell. He passed away in the mid 80s, but he was known as sort of, I guess, the father of the study of mythology. In that process, which was largely above my pay grade, he brought out the fact that there were goddesses for hundreds, maybe thousands of years, long before there were gods. I mean, the female gods before there were male gods. And it just occurred to me to ask you if there was anything that crossed your thinking about the ancient mythology that got imported into this genderization of presumably religion from ancient times. Anyway, just a passing thought and question.
Yeah, I think this connects to this idea of like what gets considered religion and what gets considered pagan, and even like in Adventism, we wanted to fit in with the evangelicals, so we better have men running things because that's what evangelicals do. And if we let women be leaders, we're going to be seen as an odd, weird cult. And so, we could think about what gets called pagan, and in the Catholic Church too, like what they consider religion versus what they consider the superstition that's outside of what it's supposed to be. We could think about things like, the veneration of Mary or different types of saints. We could think about, when religion becomes more institutionalized and organized, it moves away from being a brief aside basically on this invention of religion topic. Historically, ancient religion was tied to a place. So if you think about what was the name of the religion of the Egyptians, it didn't have a name. It was the religion of the Egyptians. What was the religion of the Phoenicians? It was the religion of the Phoenicians. And you followed it if you were there. You might keep it if you left, but it wasn't some sort of organized and systematized thing with like universities and books trying to evangelize itself. Modern religion got really organized and systematized. It separated itself from local cultures and became globalized and universalizing and saying, we are correct. These are the teachings. These are what you're supposed to follow. And so ancient religion was much more tied to local places, to nature. Modern religion is these kind of institutions and organizations. We could also then think about the ways that's gendered. So yes, so like if you think about like Hinduism, it has like women goddesses, but it's also Hinduism. It's kind of weird to call Hinduism a religion, and this is a book called The Invention of Religion in India, that historically Hinduism wasn't a religion. It was the cultural beliefs, practices, and values of the people of India. And the people in the West said, hey, this is your religion. It's called Hinduism. This is what it is. Same with Japan. People's religions, they try to name it something. Confucianism, there's been a debate. Is Confucianism a religion? Is it a local philosophy? So, these ideas of, I think that kind of as religion institutionalizes and organizes more, as we move from the wild grove to the cultivated garden, we become, closer to and more towards some of these masculine type things, and sometimes having less room for some of the, historically maybe spiritual, connected to nature, more feminine type spiritual practices and beliefs. And I think that sometimes what people are going back to, like people are going back to goddesses more. And so I think I have another project where I'm making this argument that we have kind of religious change is sort of this pendulum, and we move towards more organized and systematized, and then people get too sick of it being too organized and systematized, and then they want it to be more authentic. And so this is how reform cycles go, that the Catholic Church got too systematized and organized and missed the thing, so Luther had to, challenge that. Then Lutheranism became institutionalized and organized, and then people had to rebel from that. And so, as a new religious movement organizes, it kind of loses some of the, kind of wild elements that it used to have that sometimes get perceived as more authentic, and that I think is some of what people are moving back to now.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Doug. Francis, you are next in line to join the conversation. Please go ahead and unmute.
Okay, thank you. I'm fascinated too, and I hope you'll let Lauren know when your book comes out so we can purchase it. But I'm wondering, I believe that Ellen White says, it's been a while since I've read it, that men should be the spiritual leaders in the home, but yet it's the woman who does the teaching of the religion. And I believe it's the same in the Muslim culture. I had a mother who told me, she was a parent of one of the children I had. She said, it's up to me to teach the Quran to our children. So then where is the connect where the men then become the leaders when they've learned from women that the religion?
This is a great question. And I think part of it is a distinction between who gets called a leader and who does the work. So if you look at a church and you think about how it actually functions, if the women weren't there, the things wouldn't get done. Yeah, there'd be a pastor that delivers a sermon, but if you think about potluck, if you think about all the Sabbath schools, if you think about just the general things, it's women oftentimes doing the labor, but men kind of in the position of authority. And so I think that this happens a lot of times in families where the man is like officially the spiritual or religious leader of the home. But then if you think about, who is teaching the kids religion, the amount of time that they're spending, it might be that the woman is doing 90% of the actual instruction and teaching of the kids, and is the one taking them to church, whereas the man is like, yes, this is what you should do, and then kind of goes away. So you could kind of think about it as like pardon the analogy. Imagine the man being a spiritual leader, sort of similar to how God was a spiritual leader giving the 10 Commandments. Like, you can go wander in the wilderness for a while, then you come talk to me, I'll give you the 10 Commandments, then you're going to go wander for a while again. You're kind of on your own, but when I speak, you have to listen. Whereas a woman's leadership might be more involved and time invested, but then maybe a little less proclamation when it happens. So I think that this is maybe some of the difference of the, religious leadership in the home, that the man, this is what you have to do, this is leadership time. But then the woman is kind of spending the time of actually, who's reading the children the Bible, probably the woman's spending more time doing it. And so I think this is some of the difference, whereas the one is the symbolic leader and the one is the one, if you think about who's spending more time doing it.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Francis. Really, really great question. And I think we see that not just in the church, but in lots of workplaces too. Lauren, please go ahead and join the conversation.
Oh, it's so nice to see Francis here. Thank you, Francis, for being here. She and her husband, their daughter, has gone through pretty serious cancer, and she just sent me a note saying that she seems to be cancer free. So praise the Lord for that. So happy to hear that. I haven't Sue, I think it is. Is it Sue? I don't think I've never met Sue as far as I know, but I'm so happy to hear that news. I have met Francis and Paul, however. Landon, let's go back to something you mentioned earlier. I'm still absolutely puzzled, and I understand why so many people in our church and those. I actually had a pastor of another denomination once asked me. He says, "So you don't ordain women?" I said, "No." He said, "But Ellen White." I mean, he knew enough about the church to know Ellen White. And let's go back to that. I'm still puzzled. Not that you need to know the whole psychological evolution of what happened in the Adventist church, but it still continues to puzzle me. You would think that people would say, of all the organizations in Christendom, yours should be the one that is most eager to jump in and ordain women because you owe so much to a woman. And I don't know quite how our leaders get around that. You probably have looked at it. You might know a little more than I do. But isn't it astonishing that we've managed to find to wiggle away through this problem while quoting Ellen White left and right all the time? I mean, we've actually, I would make the argument, and somebody also did it in an article I published this past week, I think it was Ed, in fact, that we actually put Ellen White above the Bible because we can't accept anything in the Bible unless Ellen White okays it. So she basically has the stoplight on anything that we say. She has the interpretation of everything we say. How did we end up in this situation, Landon? I don't expect you to have the whole answer, but let's talk about that. That is really important.
Yeah, no, this is part of what drew me to sociology, because I was like, why would this be the case? This doesn't make sense. It seems like a puzzle that. So a lot of what I'll say here comes from a book that I had on a slide, but I'll name it again for anyone who's interested. It's called Seventh-day Adventism in Crisis: Gender and Sectarian Change in an Emerging Religion by Laura Vance. So the book is Seventh-day Adventism in Crisis. So basically, she was interested in this puzzle as well. And she traced kind of how Adventism did have women leading more than a lot of other types of groups at the time. But then a lot of this came about when Adventism didn't want to be seen as sectarian or cultish anymore. So when they wanted to fit in with broader society, the pathway to do that was fitting in as essentially an evangelical denomination. So to not be a cult, they needed to figure out, how do we get accepted as an evangelical denomination? Evangelical denominations at the time were not, and in many ways still today, part of what distinguished an evangelical denomination versus, say, like a mainline denomination would be that you don't really have women in leadership roles. And so that was a part of it. Then there was this book called, I think it was called The Four Major Cults, that came out in, I think, the 40s or 50s. Then Seventh-day Adventism basically did a PR campaign that was successful. And they put out a book called Questions on Doctrine that basically traced a response to, these are the ways you might think we're a cult, here's why we're not. In that book, one could make the case that the theology of Jesus changed. That Adventism did not have the Trinity in exactly the same way as other religions, and they actually saw it as kind of a Catholic thing that they pushed against in some ways. It wasn't that Jesus was not important, but the whole idea of the Catholic theology of the Trinity wasn't really there. In Questions on Doctrine, they basically embraced the Catholic doctrine of the Trinity. And part of that also involved, embracing some social things to fit in with the groups that they wanted to fit in with. And one of those things was limiting women's leadership. And so, the case could be made that women were ordained and given leadership opportunities early on, that then this reduced as they wanted to fit in. And then when they were responding specifically to these cult allegations, which, those four major cults, the other three still get considered cults, and Adventism mostly doesn't anymore. So the others were Christian Science, Jehovah's Witness, and Mormons. So Adventism kind of succeeded in its PR campaign, but it changed its theology and then also some of its social structures. And one of them was women not having as much leadership opportunity. Some of that book was also highlighting the Bible in some ways. And then it wasn't necessarily downplaying Ellen White, but there was some kind of caution about wanting to make Ellen White's writings not necessarily seem the same as Joseph Smith. And so, yeah, I think that a lot of it was Adventists not wanting to be seen as a cult, then basically having to do what it took to fit in with an evangelical denomination label, and then doing what the evangelicals do. And so it was kind of a cultural and political thing to be evangelical that is part of what then meant that women were no longer leaders in the same way.
And yet there are lots of fairly legitimate Christian religions that do have women in leadership. They're not evangelical necessarily, but Methodist, Presbyterians, United Church of Christ, Episcopalians all have women in leadership. You would think at least there'd be some kinship there. I suppose we want to shun those too, in a way, separate ourselves from them.
I think some of it
makes
too
sense.
is the cultural and religious moment at which the desire to not be seen as a cult played out. I think if it played out now, it wouldn't have been as necessary to keep women from leadership to not be seen as a cult. Let's say Adventism had started later or had kind of accepted a cult label longer, and in this current present moment said, okay, let's be seen as a denomination now. I don't know if the gender thing would have played out in the same way, because I think it would have been seen as, it's not automatically cultish to let women lead now, whereas in the 1950s, it would have been seen as kind of quite cultish to allow women to be pastors.
Yeah, right, like the Shakers. and people like that. Yeah, a lot of them were. So you kind of trace it back to that Donald Gray Barnhouse interaction there in the 50s, late 50s.
Yeah, and it is the case that new religious movements have traditionally sometimes had women in positions of authority more so than a lot of the established longer term like things that got counted as religion. So this again gets back to this: what gets counted as religion versus superstition, or what gets counted as religion or cult. And people wanting their religion to be seen as religion, and Adventism in part wanting to be seen as religion, downplaying women's authority.
Yeah, so this is all about legitimization in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Landon.
All right, thanks so much, Lauren. I had a bit of a follow-up question again. So one of the first sentences in the short brief that you had shared spoke about, men in the pulpit, women in the pews. And, as you were having the conversation just now, Nick made a comment in the chat that said it should be noted that quite often the loudest voices against female leadership are the women. From a sociology perspective, it's quite interesting. Whenever I hear other women speaking out against it, that baffles me. But then I've also accepted that I grew up in a family and in a culture where women in leadership was normalized. So how did we get to that point where women are like, no, we believe the men should and women should not?
Yeah, this is a great question. So when we think about something like women and men, we think about these like two separate groups that are distinct. Like this is what a woman is, this is what a man is. Each of us, though, is a lot of stuff at once. So like, someone could be a woman, someone could have a particular race, a particular sexuality, a particular nation they're from, a class level, a particular profession that they have, etc. And so you can't just say like, okay, this person's a woman, therefore she should think this. Some of my other research has shown that because women are more religious, they tend to be more conservative on certain gender-related things in society. Not that I want to necessarily get into it here, and I know that Adventism has a specific type of place in this, but one of the things I found was that in the United States, it appears that it is women who are more opposed to a woman's right to choose abortion than it is men. So, when policies come out, there's all these responses that say men shouldn't tell women what to do with their bodies. But then if you think about, like Amy Barron Cohen, some in the Supreme Court that is against abortion. And so, it's not necessarily just that it's men saying what women should do. It's a certain outlook on life, an approach to life that sometimes religion or politics or other things are tied up in. There's an interesting book, it might be called The Women of the Klan. I can't remember if that's exactly the name of the book, but it's about, why would women participate in the Ku Klux Klan when women are marginalized, and also the Ku Klux Klan is patriarchal. But part of the argument is that it's white women, especially maybe ones who don't have power and status in other areas, that then whiteness is a place where they do have power. And so, every person has a lot of things that are important to them. And it might be that, a woman who's against women's ordination might in part be a function just of these are her religious beliefs and this is what she thinks. And her gender, she doesn't perceive as being necessarily a part of that. And it may or may not be. And so part of an argument I make, and part of the things that I didn't get to because I didn't want to take forever, because it's also sort of complex to explain, is that if women are more religious than men, women's politics will be more affected by religion than men's politics. And so I'm able to show that cross-nationally, Muslim women are a lot more likely to support abortion comparatively than are Christian women, but a part of it is who's more religious and how being religious associates with views on abortion. So basically, I think it's like a complex mix of things. And one of the things that happens is that if a group faces disadvantage, they then are more pulled to religion and get more out of it. But then religion then shapes their views on various factors.
Thank you so very much. And we have a few more hands. Thank you for jumping out the chat and joining the conversation. Chris, please go ahead.
Yeah, I wish I had a better question formed in my mind, but I'm kind of going off of what Lauren mentioned, and I'm going to hit my little send button here in the chat of a few influential women who might be perceived on the extremes of Christianity at certain times. Mary Baker Eddy, Amy Sample McPherson, Catherine Kuhlman are the three that came to mind. It may have been, as we've been discussing, the desire of the church to move away from cult status to more legitimate status, to prove ourselves not to be part of Pentecostal extremism, etc. Why, we dispensed with all the women who were in leadership positions in the early Adventist church and just gave all those positions to men. Those are the thoughts that kind of came to my mind, and I thought I would bring up that question to continue the dialogue on that. I don't know why more men aren't involved in their churches, on a lay basis. I used to be a pastor, and now I'm a layman, but I don't go to church very often for a variety of factors. But sometimes you don't go because you don't want to go. My dad hated the handshaking time. He wanted to go to church, listen, and go home. He didn't socialize with anybody when he went to church. Of course, he was from North Dakota, so maybe, Lauren, that's the reason. I don't know. But those are a few of my comments today, and just thought I'd make them and raise my hand and join the conversation.
Yeah, that's a good question. So a couple of thoughts. So one, yeah, the women leaders, they are viewed as more extremist in part just because they're different, and those women wouldn't probably have been allowed to lead in any mainstream religion, and then if they start their own, now it's seen as some new extreme thing. Scholars have moved away from calling things cults to calling them new religious movements because what gets defined as a cult is often an issue of power. So like depending on how you define cult, a lot of mainstream religions would end up fitting the bill. And really, it's whoever is new and not yet established is who others end up calling cults. Obviously, some groups do things that are very problematic or harmful, but a group, just by the fact that they're new, is basically probably going to get called a cult. And then on this point about men's involvement, I think it made it into the book. I can't remember, but I'll tell the story here, and it might be in there if you read the book too. I remember, so I had this friend that I was close friends with when I was young. Then when I was at Andrews, he was at Andrews at the same time. I was able to reconnect. It was great to see my friend. And it was like very interesting to then hear, I was studying theology. He was studying to be a lawyer. And he said this very interesting thing to me. We were talking about religion and then like who it appeals to and why. And he basically said that for him as a man, religion doesn't offer him very much. That when he goes to church, it just is people trying to socialize, talking about feelings. He didn't know for him like what the point was for him as a man. We could also think about what you said about the handshake time, or we think about potluck. Like who is going there to socialize and see people? Now things have changed more, but historically, women didn't necessarily have a lot of chances to engage outside the home. And church was one of the main places where they could actually see people. Men maybe were at work all day and they're like, I don't want to go to church. I already saw too many people. I've done all my socializing for the week. I don't want any more. And so church in some ways is, yes, a place where religious teaching happens, but it's also just a place where it's like a social community support group where you have shared values and you do things together. And it's a community. And women are maybe perceived as, and maybe do get more from those communal aspects. Whereas the man is like, yeah, like, can you just send me like the summary? I'll read it. Like, I want the information here. And so what is the purpose and function of it? So I think that's a part of it. And that, yeah, like my friend, he basically was like, I believe all of it, but actually going to church, it's just, they just talk about feelings. They sing some songs. It was very similar to what some of the respondents said about the songs are too mushy. And I don't feel like I get anything as a man out of this. There are groups now that have been doing these kind of masculine typed church services, like Cowboy Church. There's even these Fight Church. There's these Christian nationalist things, and then they have like, I don't know, MMA and motorcycles and stuff. But traditionally, church is a place where you go and socialize with your friends and sing songs and eat food together. And that then is a gendered assumptions about like who wants to do what type of community.
I'm too old to participate in MMA church. I'm just going to state that right now. And I'm not going back to potluck until mystery casseroles are banned. So that's my my comment on that. And thank you again for the presentation.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Chris, for joining the conversation. Linda, please go ahead. Looking forward to what you have to say.
Thank you, Cherry Ann. Landon, thank you for your presentation. Appreciate it very much. All the thought and research that went into that. I'm just curious about something. Um, if one subscribes to the concept of the Trinity, three gods that are one God, which I do, um, if one is an adherent of that belief, when you look at the way that you describe some of the cultural delineations of roles between men and women, for example, women are perhaps responsible for inculcating religious values into the children, loving, comforting the family. I'm just wondering what is, or is there a legitimate basis to assume that all members of the Trinity are male gendered? I mean, is that just something that has just sort of culturally been assumed? It's not really a terrible stretch to consider that perhaps the Holy Spirit is a woman, based on the things that the Bible. I see Frances clapping her hands. I'm with you, Frances. The Bible describes the Holy Spirit's responsibilities in very much akin to the way that we culturally consider a woman's responsibilities. I mean, are we going to be surprised someday when we get to heaven that the female gender is represented in the Godhead, and we were just misled through male translations of Scripture?
Yeah, so this is a great question. I'll note a couple things. So one, there are definitely, patterns in what people believe about God and whether they're open to God being like different ways of thinking about God's gender. So someone could say that God is that if all humans are represented in God, that God, in some ways represents both or multiple genders. And yeah, definitely, people in some of my respondents, they talked about the Holy Spirit and the feminine type traits of the Holy Spirit. I'll also note, and this was a thing that when I was in the seminary, I wrote a paper on, that there was kind of this, wait, was this? Yeah, this was actually my thesis I wrote at the seminary. That there was a shift in how evangelicals thought about the Trinity. So in order to support their gender ideology of complementarianism, part of what they did is they said that God the Father and Jesus are equal, but in value, but not in authority. And they said that similarly, that humans, men and women, are complementary in equal value, but not their roles. It was basically a separate but equal argument. And so evangelical theology actually shifted in, I think it was the 80s and 90s. We also could think about, I have a friend who studies gender and Bible translations. And one of the things that he focuses on is the English Standard Translation. And that basically the English Standard Translation, a lot of what that did was to take what was perceived as overly gender neutral language from the Revised Standard Version and to update it to make it more complementarian and, to say that women can't be leaders, to not imply, that this person, to kind of change the name, like a woman maybe was named as an elder, but now she's named as a deacon. And so kind of the way we think about God, I made the case in my thesis when I was at Andrews that basically that sometimes Christians construct their concepts of God based on their own experiences and views in life around them. So this is not maybe an extreme claim at all to say that, if you think God is like a human, what you understand humans like will shape how you view God. And so, yeah, so basically
but God is, yeah. But God is described as a father in Scripture.
Yeah. So, but does when something like a God is put in human terms, what does that mean? And is God limited to one gender? And with something like the Trinity, is it that God the Father has more authority and Jesus has less, or is it that they just kind of, not exactly like this, but kind of like decided together or flip a coin, like, I'm going to be the one that stays in heaven. I'm going to be the one that goes and sacrifices myself on earth. Therefore, I'm going to be the one that's called Father. I'm going to be the one that's called Son. Because human ideas of what like a father and a son are don't really make sense for a God, a Trinity that is thought to exist forever. Like that, how does the one, beget the other? So yeah, I think basically that humans, we oftentimes project our views about society and gender onto God. And I think that a lot of times our society is patriarchal, and so we project our own assumptions about what we think about society onto then what we believe about God.
Well, and perhaps if we had been more egalitarian in those assumptions, it might have affected culture more positively in terms of creating opportunities for women.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great question.
All right. Thank you so much, Linda. Gino, you are next to join the conversation. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Sherry Ann. My mind is going in circles here based on everything that's said. I thought it was so interesting, Landon, when you talked about the religion of Egypt or the religion of Phoenicia, and that people would just accept that as part of their culture. And you wonder how much of that impacts, and I think it always impacts our view of God. In what we've been talking about here, Lauren had raised the issue about, in a church that's dominated or originated by Ellen White, why is it that women are not allowed to be ordained or put in positions of leadership? And I think it has to do with power. And I think it does have to do with our culture, where women, if you think about the Constitution of the United States, it's all men were created equal, because at the time, women were often looked at as property. And so I think that a vision of the church was set upon a system where women were treated as property, and how did men deal with that? So I think when you have a patriarchal church where men are in leadership, women are always perceived as followers. And I thought Patty Tompkins made a really excellent point in the comments about, of course, men always know how women feel about things, better than women do. It's just very strange being a woman in a patriarchally dominated church. And I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, so men always think they know things. An interesting pattern that I think is very funny is that if you ask married couples whether they voted in the same way in an election, men are more likely to say yes than women are. In part because the women have to tell the men the things that will make them not get angry. So there's this argument that when you're someone who is marginalized and not in the center, you have to deal with the ways that the people in the center get angry and emotional. We could think about, politicians, and people say women are too, emotional to be a politician. Men are pretty emotional sometimes, and oftentimes too, people are having to kind of deal with their egos and manage their emotions. And so part of all of this is that women are kind of stuck in the position of making sure that men don't get too angry or mad, and to manage the emotions of the men, in addition to then having their own emotions and recognizing that the men are being emotional, but that they won't accept that they are, and then have to deal with the outcomes of that. So I think that there's definitely sort of these, if patriarchy is the structural position of society, that this then infiltrates the church. And then we could think about then how this shapes our images of God. And what you mentioned about gender, I often like to think about comparisons between, say, gender and race. And so if we project onto God these images of, just men, if you look at people's paintings of God, they're often white. There's no reason to think that God would be white. If you think about Jesus and who, the place where he lived, when we paint these white Jesuses, it makes no sense. People think that a white guy with long hair is Jesus. When I was at the seminary, people asked me to play Jesus in a play just because my hair was long and I had a beard. And that I fit kind of the image of what people paint of Jesus, but that is not of what Jesus would have been. And so, yeah, I think that society then colors the way we then approach and think about things that are images of God, that are ideas about the home and family, that I think oftentimes, too, we could think about the ways women have led, even without then in work, but not authority. And that I think a lot of churches are essentially run by women and by their work, but they're not then going to be named as the people who did the work or the effort or had the leadership. And so I think, too, that a lot of work happens behind the scenes, and that I think, too, that men don't realize some things sometimes because they don't have to be aware of stuff that sometimes women do have to be aware of. Or the same goes for things like race as well, that Black people know things about society that white people don't even have to think about.
All right. Thank you so much, Gino. Thank you for that
Thank you,
response.
Landon.
Yeah.
Shelley, please go ahead and join the conversation.
Yes, thank you. Wow, there's so much to process here that I had a hard time even forming a question, so it took me a while to raise my hand. But I'm struck on moving the conversation maybe a little bit in my question here, from research to reclamation, as it were. What do we do moving forward, I guess is my question. Because in all of this, I hear a lot of discussion when we talk about the Bible and creation, about how long ago it was, what matter and manner in which it was formed, and we don't speak a lot about the section where it mentions that God kind of had a discussion with God's self and said, "Let us create man, humans, in our image, male and female. Let's create them." And I wonder if a part of the problem we have and the struggle we have with faith as Christians doesn't have to do with our different views on what image means. Are we talking? I think we've always sort of expected that we were talking some sort of physicality, and yet we're animals, we're mammals, we're primates in a very basic developmental sense, very similar to the rest of our created creatures. And so image must mean something else. And that kind of frees it, I think, from the gender scope and that consideration. But even now within the church, though we have a female who functioned so prominently in the leadership, we still have these roles and these expectations. And I was amused at Lauren talking about how he's not naturally emotional. And yet I grew up in a household where kind mothers and grandmothers let me go and sit in the living room where the men were discussing theology and religion after church, and didn't require me to be in the kitchen cooking, because that's who I was. And it wasn't the norm for what good little Christian girls necessarily were expected to be. But it shifted and it impacted the whole rest of how I related to the church and what roles I was to go on and lead. And so I guess my question, though I have a hard time forming it, is what conversations can we have with each other about who God is, about how we are in the image of God? Right now, we're asking permission from our church entities and leaderships yet again to include women officially in our church as leaders. But that has such an impact all the way down the row for how the future little Adventist girls in the church will be allowed to think and view themselves, how others will view them. It's not just even a pastor question. So I guess that's my question in terms of studies. What things shift that conversation in your research? How do those expected roles get shattered and changed, or gently molded, if we're going to be loving and compassionate and nurturing about them? Because I see great differences in the nurturing capacity of my children's generation as they become fathers and marriage partners. And so something can change. And how can we, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, this is a great question. My hopeful but not that hopeful answer is that the change is already happening, but it is slow and it is behind. So one of the studies that I've done looked at changing attitudes towards women working. And one of the things I was curious about, I thought, you know what, I'm guessing that evangelicals are more against it, but what has the change been over time? And when I tracked change over time, what I found was that basically all religious groups shifted at about the same rate. They started at a different place, they ended at a different place, but they all moved And they all moved in similar ways. So basically, evangelicals became much more supportive of the idea of women working outside the home over time. Evangelicals, compared to, say, mainline Protestants or Catholics, or especially secular people, are still more opposed to it, but they've moved. And so what I would say is that I think on a lot of stuff, the movement is happening, but that it happens in ways where no one even really notices that it happens, and that the questions and the debates that we used to have just kind of stop happening. For example, I could imagine a time when Adventists spent a lot of time debating mustard and black pepper. I don't know if there are, all that many Adventists who are that concerned with this issue anymore. There was a time where, because of things Ellen White said, that people might have said that you shouldn't read novels. That is a type of thing that I don't think that people are as concerned about anymore. So the shifts happen, but they happen in ways that you almost, you wait for the thing to change, you wait for the thing to change, it doesn't change, and then a generation later, it quietly changed. And so I could imagine a situation where, and it might take Adventism saying, oh no, we don't have enough ministers or members, we need to start allowing women to lead, and that is the type of thing that then, motivates the change. But I can imagine that there's going to be a time when women are ordained again, but I suspect it will take a while, and that by the time it does, society will have moved so far beyond that we're not even it's hard for us to be excited that it happened, because it took so long and we waited so long and it played out so slowly. And so I think that change is happening. It's just maybe a generation or two behind. And, for example, I think Adventists are mostly on board with women working outside the home now. Whereas, if we thought about 50 years ago, I don't know, the average Adventist congregation, how it would have felt about a woman who works outside the home and has a strong career.
All right. Thank you so much, Shelley, for your question. Emmanuel, please go ahead and join the conversation.
Thank you. And I enjoy your presentation. I have a question for you, but my question will be in sandwich between your presentation and the Southern Baptist Convention 2 or 3 weeks ago that banned women to the ministry. So the question I have for you, what is sociology in the Adventist Church to ban women to the ministry, and what is theology?
Yeah, this is a great question. So, the Baptist Convention banning women leaders is sort of this almost some more symbolic thing than anything else, because it kind of already wasn't allowed, and then they said, we're really not allowing it now. And so sometimes what will happen is when change is happening, there will be this thing called backlash or status threat, that when people perceive their position as faltering, they will double down on it. And so I would not be surprised if in Adventism, when people see that women's ordination is essentially, inevitable, that they then push against it even harder. Whereas, some time ago, let's say 50 years ago, I don't know if anyone was pushing that hard against women's ordination, because everyone just assumed it wasn't going to happen. And so the fact that people are actively pushing against something shows that there is potential movement on that thing. And I think that the Baptist Convention, banning women leaders just shows that they're worried about this thing, and that there would have been a time when the Baptists weren't worried about this because they didn't see it as a thing that was relevant. So social change happens in a way where a thing is not debated. Once it's starting to be debated means it's starting to change. And depending on what the thing is, everyone eventually kind of ends up at the same place on certain types of things. And I think that there's stress and worry among people that kind of see, the Baptists banning women leadership kind of shows that they know that it is happening.
All right. Thank you so much. We're down to our last question. Bob Johnson, please go ahead and join the conversation.
Yes, the conversation has predictably moved into the question of how can we have more women leaders in the church. But I think it kind of started out with the question, how can we have more men in the church? Which is in some ways a more vexing question. among evangelicals and certainly in the Adventist church, I find my masculinity being attacked theologically because some of the virtues, which the secular world considers to be virtues, are treated as disvirtues, particularly the matter of independence and dependence. Israel failed, and people in the New Testament who failed because they trusted in their own strength. They did not depend on God. They depended on themselves. And to be a good Christian, you need to acknowledge your weakness and be dependent, which is it's a disvirtue in Christianity, but a virtue in the secular world. I think Christianity was never so masculine as it was when it was able to have a jihad, during the Crusades. I think when we emphasize that Christianity is a relationship with God or with Jesus, that's the kind of an expression of femininity. But when we think of Christianity or think of the church or think of Adventism in terms of a cause that has to be fought for, then it becomes masculine and becomes more attractive to men. You see this in our devotional literature, or in our hymns and so forth all the time. Just listen to this one here. I come to the garden alone while the dew is still on the roses, and the voice I hear falling on my ear, the Son of God discloses, and he walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own. And the joy we share as we tarry there, none other has ever known. How can a man sing that? It's making Jesus your exclusive boyfriend. On the other hand, think of a hymn like number 619, Lead on, O King eternal, the day of March has come. Henceforth in fields of conquest, thy tent shall be our home. Through days of preparation, thy grace has made us strong. And now, O King eternal, we lift our battle song. Which Christianity is a masculine one and which is feminine? We have two different kinds. The kind that emphasizes a relationship and the kind that emphasizes a cause. How do you make Christianity more attractive to men? That's the thing that we haven't really talked about very much. We keep getting over to the question of how can we have more women leaders?
Yeah, no, this is a great question. And there's a lot of Christian leaders who are trying to figure out how to get more men. Ironically, among the youngest generation, it kind of seems like there are more men. I don't think it was about any success of attracting men to Christianity. I think it was largely pushing women away and pulling men in for political reasons as the cause rather than religious reasons as the cause. So this point about a cause I think is really good, but that sometimes religion becomes a culture rather than a religion. One of my PhD students, he's doing a dissertation studying Christian fiction. So he's using large language models to look at what is happening in Christian fiction books over time. One of the things he's noticing is that actual Christian content is declining. So the books are becoming about Christian worldviews and culture rather than actual religious content or having things about God happening. And I think that religion in some ways is moving towards this cultural route, and then that is providing a cause and then bringing men in. But that I think that, one could think about, could you get men involved in a cause that they care about, but actually have it be tied to the religion rather than be tied to these separate other things? And then also, how do you do it in a way that doesn't push women away? So if you just, make an MMA church, which some pastors have tried to do, it's going to be pretty hard to probably attract women to get to that church. So finding ways to get authentically to both a cause and a relationship. And I think also to help people have community. A lot of young men feel very isolated and lonely. And I think finding ways that religion could provide that community would be something that could be very appealing to men. But part of the issue is yes, they're going to have to like agree that they might need to like submit to a higher authority and participate in community rather than be this kind of lone wolf type of masculinity.
I saw something on the internet that was quite counterintuitional for me. Young people have been leaving all the churches, but some young men are coming back, and what attracts them is the more traditional kind of Christianity. They like things like the Book of Common Prayer, and they're attracted to things like Eastern Orthodoxy and things like that express ancient tradition, if you want to put it that way, but not women. How do you explain that?
So the Eastern Orthodoxy thing, I think, is in part from survey error. Part of what happens is surveys have a hard time getting young men to participate in them. And then if it's an opt-in survey and people are paid to take it, people will say that they are young men because they'll get paid more to take the surveys. So depending on where the survey is done, and if it's a population-based survey versus opt-in, there's a big difference. There might be something about this Eastern Orthodox poll, but I think that might be about, having culture and tradition and ritual, and that these sorts of things are getting pushed in some of this like stuff for young men in ways that like for women, also too, like especially if it's in another language or if it's patriarchal, I don't know like what it offers women. And so I think that part of the issue too is that as young men kind of pull away politically to the right and women politically to the left, it then creates very strange things happening with whether and how people are religious. And I think we're going to have a lot of young men who say they are Christian nationalists and say they're really religious, but then don't actually attend services. And they just talk about how religious they are, but it's more about their politics than it is necessarily about like authentic practice.
All right. Thank you so much, Landon, and thanks, Dr. Johnston.